Welcome to the ChangeMakers podcast, brought to you by City Current and powered by Lipscomb and Pitts Insurance. This show shares personal stories and insight from those who are giving back and making a difference, so we can learn and do the same. We cover life lessons, business advice, passion, and purpose. Now here's our host, Jeremy Park.
Welcome to the ChangeMakers podcast. I'm your host, Jeremy Park. We have a wonderful treat where instead of one guest, we actually have two amazing ladies. They are authors. We'll talk all about the book later on, but they're both principals and co-founders of H2Growth Strategies. We have Linda C. Hartley and Vivien Hoexter. How are you two ladies doing?
Oh, wonderful. It's a wonderful day today. It's a pleasure to be on the show with you.
Absolutely. So you are calling in because both of you are in the New York City area, or at least that's kind of where you live, and you might be all over the world at this point. The power of technology and being able to leverage for a podcast calling in. But both of you have amazing careers that have led you to what you're doing today. And we'll talk a lot about H2Growth Strategies and your work with nonprofits and your work with leaders and I mean, amazing statistics in terms of fundraising. So the show today is going to be how do we help nonprofits? How do we leverage? The book will actually go ahead and announce the book. It's called Big Impact, Insights and Stories from America's Nonprofit Leaders. So we'll be talking all about that. But let's start with you, Linda. Tell us a little bit of kind of your personal story in terms of where you grew up and how you got involved in helping nonprofits and raising a lot of money. So tell us where you grew up a little bit.
All right. Well, I grew up in New Jersey. I was acting in the theater was my school career right through college. I got accepted into the NYU Graduate School of the Arts in the 70s in acting, MFA program. Joined an off-Broadway theater company at the same time. And with that company, I learned, I did some roles, but I also learned about fundraising and learned that I was able to make a living on fundraising, as opposed to what I was experiencing as a student actress. Joined the NYU Development Office. They paid for an MBA at night. And I've been in the nonprofit sector ever since, mostly with educational, cultural organizations, social service, and some advocacy organizations. My last staff job was VP for External Affairs at Cooper Union in New York, Cooper Union for the Advancement of Science and Art. Actually, everyone that goes to the Cooper Union attends has their tuition paid for because of the very generous bequest of Peter Cooper a very long time ago. And after that, I started my own company in 2000. Vivien and I joined forces a couple of years ago to form H2Growth Strategies. And as a result, we've partnered with about 100 nonprofits to raise over $1.5 billion.
Wow.
We specialize in strategic planning, governance and board building, and fundraising.
I love it. And obviously the H2, I'm assuming, is for Hoexter Hartley, so the H twice.
Yes, that's where it came from. Yep.
Well, let's switch over, Vivien. I mean, obviously, amazing story. And I definitely will come back to the whole transition from, the acting and being on stage to being able to bring kind of that experience in. But Vivien, share a little bit of your background and your story, kind of tying in to get us to H2Growth Strategies.
Sure. So I'm also a Jersey girl. I grew up in New Jersey, and I was in the business world before I came into the nonprofit sector, and I got an MBA and thought I was going to be in marketing, consumer products marketing, and I discovered that I really couldn't relate to marketing food products like Skippy's peanut butter, which is one of the products that I worked on. And I made my way into the nonprofit sector fairly early in my career. And you might ask, well, why the nonprofit sector? So I have one Holocaust survivor parent
Wow.
still alive at 90. And so I think I always identified with the underdog, or with the person who needed assistance, needed help. And I think that has a lot to do with my being in the nonprofit sector, and the fact that it was very much a part of our lives growing up, in the sense that my parents served on some local boards and were very active in the community. So I think that also played a role. And so then I worked for over about 20 years. I worked for 4 different nonprofit organizations, including Gilda's Club Worldwide, which provides emotional and social support to people with cancer, their families and friends. I was the CEO there. And after that, I worked briefly at John Jay College of Criminal Justice for the president. And at that point, I was advised to start my own firm. I really love strategic planning. When you work inside an organization, you can't always do strategic planning. There's a lot of implementation, right?
Right.
And so so that's really why I started my own firm in 2011. And then Linda and I joined, Linda told the story of H2Growth Strategies. So here we are.
Well, I just think it's fascinating, especially when both of you individually have very successful careers, and then coming together and saying, hey, let's leverage our experiences, let's leverage our ability to help and make an even greater difference. And then obviously the next chapter is writing this book. And so, as I mentioned, the book is called Big Impact: Insights and Stories from America's Nonprofit Leaders. What led you to taking this next step of writing a book together?
I'll leave it to you, Vivien, for this.
Okay. So when we formed the business a little over 2 years ago, we really wanted to do something big as one of our first sort of projects together. And we were advised to write something. And we chose not to write, an article or a series of articles or a couple newsletters. We chose to write.
Go big, right?
Yeah, exactly. And so now, if you told us beforehand how much work it would be to write a book, maybe we wouldn't have done it. But we're glad that we did.
Sure. Well, that's where ignorance is bliss sometimes is always helpful, where it's like, if you don't know, then you just blindly go through, and at the end you're like, wow, that's a lot of work. But in the end, the payoff is always important because you get to make a difference.
Yes, absolutely. And so, what do Linda and I know? We know the nonprofit sector and the foundation world, and we've worked with many wonderful leaders over the years. And so we decided to write about leadership, and that's how the idea for the book was born. And then I think initially we were going to interview maybe, the initial number was maybe 20 or 25 people. But then we were so kind of inspired, and we kept thinking about different areas within the sector that we hadn't covered yet.
Right.
Like at a certain point, a friend of mine who works with many spiritual leaders said, you have to have some spiritual leaders in there. It's obvious.
Right.
And of course, we hadn't thought of that. So, so in the end, we interviewed nearly 50 leaders.
Wow.
Yeah. So,
and it's a good group. I mean, just looking at Rockefeller Brothers Fund, the Ford Foundation, Goodwill Industries International, Share Our Strength, the Nature Conservancy, PBS, DoSomething.org. So to your point, I mean, obviously having diversity, but having very well-known, established, and everything in between to be able to share their thoughts. I think that's an important layer, so that, to your point, you kind of cover all the different sides of nonprofit work.
We tried. At a certain point, we realized that it was impossible,
Sure.
So we stopped.
Well, talk about the process of just what it's like to set up those interviews, to ask those questions, share the process of especially for those, because there's so many that I run across that say, hey, I want to write a book, I want to get the interviews. I mean, obviously, to your point, it's a lot of work. Not only doing the interviews, but then obviously putting it together in terms of what's the most important things and how do you tie the themes together. But share what the interview process was like and kind of how that came about.
Sure. We conceived the book before the presidential elections, but really started the interviews after the presidential elections. So there were a lot of people that wanted to talk. That was number one. Also, a nice coincidence was that the independent sector, which is a national organization of both foundations and nonprofit organizations, held its annual conference in Washington, D.C. right after the presidential elections. So we were able to go to that conference and gather a good number of interviews right at the conference, because they were coming from all over the country. So that was a really good way to start the interviews. The others were from our personal connections, from recommendations, from a desire to make sure that there was diversity in many ways, and not only racial, but also opinions and geographic representation across the country, and also diversity of the fields that the nonprofit sector represents, as Vivien mentioned. Any from the environment to social causes, and advocacy to health, education, the arts, and more. So there was a lot of it ended up being a very unique and diverse, visionary, powerful group of leaders across the country talking about leadership and how social change is affected.
Well, so, and as I mentioned at the onset, you have the ability you take those interviews and you start looking at, okay, what are the common themes? Let's break these up. Let's kind of break this up into usable pieces so that anyone who is reading the book can take the best practices, take the lessons learned, and be able to apply this. And as I mentioned, you kind of broke it down into 7 principles. And I'll let you talk about each of those principles and kind of overview of what they are. But the first one is sharpen your leadership skills, ensure your own house is in order. So those are 2 of them. But talk about taking these interviews, breaking them down into themes, and then putting them into these 7 principles so that as people read the book, they literally can be learning and using these lessons learned to help them become more successful, to make a big impact in their own organization.
Got it. So, Linda, shall I start?
Sure.
So the first thing is that the principles were not immediately apparent. We had a ton of material, right? We had these nearly 50 interviews ranging in length from 30 to 90 minutes. And what we did was as you said, we started, and I actually printed them out and laid them on the floor and used highlighters and looking for commonalities, for themes. And that was a good place to start. It was the only place to start. But then we needed to, before we even came up with these principles, we needed sort of an organizing framework. And I have this really, really smart marketer friend from college, and we got on the phone with her. We were actually tearing our hair out because for months we've been looking at all this material and thinking, what the heck are we going to do with it?
Right.
Where's the book? And so we got on the phone with Leslie, and she asked us some really pointed questions about, what is it that will differentiate this book, and what is it that you learned, and questions like that. And then she said, it was as though a light bulb had gone on. She said, this book is about social change. This is a good news book. Mm-hmm. This is a book that will teach people about how to make social change and also inspire them, because the wisdom of the leaders is so inspiring.
Right.
And so at that point, we were able to sort of see the print, because if you know that the book is about if we knew that the book was about social change, then we could look for what seemed to be the principles hidden in the interviews for making successful social change.
Well, I think too, it takes on a whole new purpose and a whole new meaning in the context of, instead of just helping nonprofits become more successful, now it's how do we create social change? That's a much larger opportunity and a much larger ability to influence and to inspire and to make a difference. So I think in a cool way, that's a little bit of a perspective shift, but a paradigm shift even for the book itself.
Yes.
It absolutely was.
Yes.
And so, Linda, do you want to talk a little bit about the actual principles?
I think you should just keep going.
Okay. All right. So there we uncovered 7 principles, and they are organized in a particular way. They're organized from the inside out, meaning starting with the leader and then moving outward to his or her organization, and then from the organization out to the area of endeavor of that organization, and finally to society as a whole. And so that's why the first principle is sharpen your leadership skills.
Right.
So I'll go through them real fast, and then I'll come back and talk about each one a little bit.
Sure.
So sharpen your leadership skills. Number 2, to ensure your own house is in order. Number 3, be crystal clear about your goal, articulate it persuasively. Number 4, campaign on many fronts. Number 5, build broad-based coalitions. Number 6, persist. And number 7, leverage your success.
Nice.
So those are the 7 principles.
I like how you said at the beginning too, it's kind of inward out. So that makes a lot of sense as well, as, fine tuning inward and then pushing outward. I think I like that description. So I think that's pretty neat as well for the principles.
Oh, great. Thank you. So sharpen your leadership skills is what it sounds like, right? It's that anyone who wants to make social change has to be the best possible leader they can be. There are lots of different ways to sharpen those skills. Really critical is building emotional intelligence and self-awareness. If there's one thing that characterizes these leaders, it's emotional intelligence and self-awareness. So seeking out and cultivating mentors is very important. Some people say that working in direct service earlier in your career is critical to your ability to later on lead organizations that are involved in direct service.
Huh.
And so, some of our leaders talk about trying to achieve life balance.
Right.
And some of them, like Larry Kramer, who runs the William and Flora Hewlett Foundation, which is one of the largest foundations in the country, Larry said, there's no such thing as work-life balance. There's just life, and work is part of it.
Yeah,
I fall on that spectrum for sure. Where I tell people all the time, it's all together. I can't really separate it out, and in many cases, who you are in your day, it's just it ebbs and flows dramatically. But I agree. There's no, at least from my perspective, such thing as balance. It's just a matter of on any given moment you're on a continuum.
Right. So that's principle number 1. Principle number 2 we called ensure your own house is in order. And what we mean by that is make sure your own organization is as functional as it can possibly be before you go out and try to make real lasting social change. And again, many elements to that: recruiting talented, passionate employees, then giving them autonomy in decision making. So Shale Polikow-Saransky, who runs the Bank Street College of Education, which is one of the leading colleges of education in the country, told us a story about a mentor of his, a principal of a high school in Queens, who taught him what it meant to have autonomy. So the way Shale expressed it, he learned very quickly what point A was, namely where they were, and then what point B, the goal was, right? So the incredible clarity about the project or the objective of the project. And then his boss would give him enormous autonomy in figuring out how to get to point B.
Right.
And this is it's a great way of hiring and retaining smart people. And so we really think it's a great point.
Well, it's funny you say that, because we use the description all the time, especially with college students and those that we're looking to hire. And anytime we're out, in the community talking about that same thing, is just the natural curiosity, the natural taking initiative and leadership. And we say, we can give you point A and B, but you're left to kind of figure out how to get to Z on your own in terms of the curiosity. And that's the difference in many cases, is taking the initiative, taking the, if you don't know, being able to go and figure it out, so that, to your point, you can have autonomy, you can have flexibility with how you get to that end result, but there's a piece of it that you've got to take ownership of as an employee and as a young leader that's going to rise to the top.
Yes, and there are a couple of others, and this one is very timely. It's addressing diversity, equity, and inclusion, and continuing to address them. So one thing that really struck us about this was that pretty much everyone we talked to about this said, you're never going to stop working on diversity, equity, and inclusion. Sure. You have to start somewhere, but then you have to keep coming at it from different perspectives, different levels of the organization, different ways of doing it, and you can really never rest. That was one of the big learnings for us from that part of the conversation.
I'm curious, did anybody, how much, this is a different thing that we struggle with here in Memphis, for instance, and there's a grant makers forum and then a group of nonprofit leaders that get together on a regular basis, and we have these sort of conversations. They're twofold. One is, where did any of them ever talk about, or has it ever come up in terms of the groups that you serve, having them have a voice, like on the board? So in other words, if you're serving those who are in poverty, or if you're a board that serves college students, do you have college students on your board to be that voice, to know that you are making a difference and looking at it from their lens? And then the other one is, I'm curious if it came up too, is incentivizing from the foundation perspective. So in other words, looking at, do foundations, holding them accountable, looking at the diversity of the board, saying, yes, you might have 100% giving, but let's look at the diversity of your board and make that a factor of our ability to give, so that in other words, it kind of incentivizes the ability to focus on diversity and inclusion, and not just diversity of skin color, but of thoughts and experiences, and kind of back before, those that you serve being a voice on your board. Did any of that factor in at all? I'm just curious.
Oh, very, very much so. Very much so. So first of all, I would say, particularly for these larger organizations, right, because the foundations we spoke with one exception, were really very large.
Sure.
There's tremendous pressure on them to diversify their boards. Tremendous pressure now. I mean, there's been pressure for a while,
right?
But it's really intense now. And so I would say, from that perspective, they're really, really focused on that.
Sure.
And on the other hand, right, so one of the people we interviewed was Teresa Younger, who runs the Ms. Foundation for Women, which happens to be based here in New York. And she said, we asked her this question about board diversity, and she said, if you're in New York with 9 million people, you're telling me you can't find enough diversity for your board? Right. I mean, she was just sort of incredulous, right? But in terms of, we didn't directly address having the people who were served on boards, but in our own work, we advise clients to at least think about having clients, their clients, the people they serve, represented in some way on their boards.
Well, I just think the whole conversation, to your point, I mean, obviously with social media today, it's being forced a little bit, but I think these are very important questions that, and I like the fact that, on your end, you're addressing it at a very real level and encouraging those to do that. But I just think these are important questions that nonprofits and all of us need to look and say, hey, this is important. We need to focus on this. It must be a priority, because we become stronger in that process. So I just think it's an important piece that does need to be there.
Yes, and I agree. And we do quite a bit of, we help nonprofits diversify and strengthen their boards at the same time. One doesn't have to, give in to the other. And as really Teresa Younger of the Ms. Foundation said, if you need someone from, if you're looking for a Black African American male in communications, that's it's a lot of the people we interviewed said that there has to be the intent.
Right.
The intent is important, and the awareness. And Younger also said, at some point you have to say no to the next white female that comes, on the list, for the board, to again, express that intent.
Right. All about intentionality. And I think that leads into the third one, which is be crystal clear about your goal, articulate it persuasively, is being very crystal clear, being very intentional about what your goals are. And I like the fact that you kind of add that comma and articulate it persuasively. So that's an important piece of it, is not only setting the goals and being very crystal clear, but being able to persuade others, to inspire others, to galvanize. Obviously that's the communication piece is extremely important. So elaborate a little bit on the being crystal clear about your goal and articulating it persuasively.
Great. So we do a lot of strategic planning with clients. And one of the things that is really clear has always been clear to us and was affirmed by these leaders is that unless you're really, really clear about where you're going, you're not going to get there, right? And in addition to that, in an era when there are so many nonprofits and donors are more and more sophisticated, it's incredibly important to be able to articulate that goal persuasively and well,
right?
Because unless you can do that, you may have a great goal, right? Like Share Our Strength is working on ending childhood hunger in the U.S. and they've made tremendous strides with this, but they knew that without a rallying cry that would appeal to a broad audience, sort of like a tagline, that they weren't going to have the impact that they needed to have. So the organization is called Share Our Strength, but in the last maybe decade, what most people have heard is No Kid Hungry. Mm-hmm. So No Kid Hungry is the campaign to end childhood hunger. But it's really Share Our Strength. But they've been pushing that, and that's the one that most of us know, because the difference between Share Our Strength, which is lovely but very sort of abstract,
sure,
right, to No Kid Hungry, which is very, very concrete and measurable,
very direct, right? Absolutely.
So, yep. So that's really what we meant by that, and also in that goal we talk about ensuring that your solution can be enlarged with quality. So this is the idea that some great ideas can be replicated and some cannot. And perhaps one of the best sort of examples of that in the book is Leon Botstein, who runs the Bard College in the Hudson Valley in New York, said, if you're a physician and you find a terrific cure for polio or I don't know what, and but that solution can't be replicated easily, then you're not the physician who's going to have the greatest impact. The one who's going to have the greatest impact is the one who can figure out a solution that can be replicated.
Right.
So that's really important when you're talking about global change or even community-wide change, right? So that's a little bit about number 3. Number 4 and number 5 sort of go together. So number 4 is campaign on many fronts, and number 5 is build broad-based coalitions. So what we mean by campaign on many fronts is that you cannot do just one thing. You cannot just litigate, for example, if you're talking about gay marriage, right? You cannot just advocate. You cannot just raise money, right? So you have to be willing to employ all of the tools at your disposal to make real societal change.
Right.
And often you have to change social norms. And Linda, you're really good at talking about changing social norms.
Sure. And, I think the example is really, Dan Gross at the Brady Center to Prevent Gun Violence. Their most noted campaign had to do with really encouraging parents to ask about whether their neighbors locked away their guns. It's not a matter of having the guns. It's about being safe about them, especially if your kid is going to be going over there and playing.
Right.
That's a changing a social norm around guns and making everyone safer. With Evan Wolfson, he's the founder of Freedom to Marry. Their effort was amazingly successful in the end, but it took decades. They began in the 60s. The progress really accelerated only in the last decade as their strategy evolved. As Vivien mentioned, they learned that litigation, while essential, was not winning hearts and minds. And so their strategy became about, they were also doing aggressive fundraising, but they did not ignore the rural areas in the country where, mind changing became even more critical in these areas. But by working with them, working with people in rural areas and finding common ground, because everyone knew someone, a friend or a family member who was gay everywhere across, all regions. And the language went from rights to freedom, and it was more about love than rights. And those were, very significant shifts in how they were able to, win hearts and minds. So as the campaign won legal and legislative victories in states across the country, there was far less resistance, if not outright support, of the idea of freedom to marry for gays. And in the end, he said, polling found that people may not like the idea of same-sex marriage, but they believed same-sex marriage was going to become legal.
Well, and
so it's about changing
the fact
climate.
You kind of said that the two build on each other, campaign on many fronts, build broad-based coalitions, because especially in an era where you've got so many different things, between social media, time poverty, everybody being busy, you've got, all of these things, you kind of have to be on all these different fronts. You have to break it up into bite-sized pieces. You have to, humanize the stories and create those connection points, and also to have your, I'll say ambassadors, but, people that really can push at a relational level, a personal level, the storylines and the importance of the mission, and share the impact and drive engagement with volunteerism. I think, you're kind of alluded earlier on, you were talking about how now more than ever, the donors and the nonprofits are connected. So before there were maybe intermediaries and it was a little bit more hands off. Now there's a direct relationship, especially because of social media. One click on a website and you're a donor, and the next one you're signing up to volunteer. Everything is now very direct. And so with that is opportunity, especially for nonprofits, but also too with that is a lot of competition. And so being able to carve out and create your own personal brand and your own strength is so important, but now also so difficult. So I think, I like the fact that you've kind of touched on both of those and carried that in on how do you change social norms. I mean, I think all of that is extremely important for nonprofits to understand so that they can leverage, and also for anybody. When you talk about creating a difference, these are the things you have to know. These are the things you have to embrace and leverage if you want to create real change.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Yes. Yes. So just one or two more sentences about build broad-based coalitions. So this is really the idea that if you look at the three main sectors in our country, the corporate world, the nonprofit world, and the government world. The nonprofit world, I mean, the latest estimate I saw is that about 10% of the workforce works in the nonprofit sector. So the other 90, right, works in government or corporations. So to make real change, the nonprofit sector, perhaps leading the way on social issues, perhaps, has to partner with the government and corporate and corporations to get them on board. And that is really critical if you want to make major social change, at least in this country,
right.
And I think probably everywhere. And a very important piece of that. Now, communities of faith are, technically part of the nonprofit sector, right? Churches, synagogues, mosques are part of the nonprofit sector. But the idea that often in the last decades, nonprofits have sometimes ignored communities of faith when they're trying to get things to happen. And it was probably not a great idea, probably a mistake to ignore communities of faith, because in many places, communities of faith are what ties the community together.
Right.
And
especially here in Memphis.
has tremendous influence, and really need to be consulted and taken into account when trying to make change in a community.
It's great advice.
So that's a little bit more about broad-based coalitions.
I think the persistence, here in Memphis, we'd say grit grind. I mean, that's kind of the obvious, you persist and you're going to make failures. You're going to succeed, but you got to grind forward and continue. Talk about leverage your success. I think this kind of last piece is really important. So share a little bit more on that one of leveraging your success.
Sure. So when of all the people we interviewed, Evan Wolfson of Freedom to Marry was the only one who had actually achieved the goal completely of gay marriage and disbanded his organization. So what Evan does a lot of the time now is he travels around the world meeting with advocates, change makers in other parts of the world who want to have gay marriage be legal in their countries. The other thing he does is he takes his expertise and consults with organizations. He was talking about one related to immigration, where you may be using some of the tactics and strategies that he used or that his movement used could be helpful in other areas. But he's unique, right, in having really achieved the goal and shut down the organization. Yeah, go ahead, Linda.
He I'm going to quote what he said about winning because I think it's very relevant here. He said, "In the most important speech I ever gave, marriage equality and the lessons for the scary work of winning, I listed 2 lessons for winning. Lesson 1 was win trumps loss. You are always going to have losses, but if you achieve your wins, they will enable you to cover your losses. Lesson 2 is that you can't win everything. You're going to lose. Of course, you should aim to win, but when you can't, you should at least fight and engage so that you lose forward."
Well, I think, what's interesting about nonprofits, and I love the context of the 10% and really being collaborative to ultimately be able to win the relationships and the trust that needs to take place to create the change. But I also like the fact that in a greater scale, most of the work when you talk about working in poverty or in education, you're probably never sadly going to eradicate poverty, right? So it's how do we still maintain the motivation, do the work day in and day out when we know it's hard work. We know we have to leverage a lot of relationships and financial resources to be able to do and to lift. But at the same time, knowing that it's an ever moving target that, to your point, you may never close down the doors. Now, obviously, you go in with the mission of, someday we'd love to have shoes on the feet of every children. But guess what? Children are consistently being born, and there's poverty in countries, and it's going to be, as much as you want to eradicate it and close up shop, the reality is you're going to have to continue forward every single day. And so I think, to your point of leveraging the successes of others and saying, here's how we can do it to shorten that learning curve is so important, but also to that kind of endless hope and struggle of, I've got to continue forward and overcome the losses because the wins will be around the corner as long as we persist. Then that's how real change is created. And you look back over 10 years, and what started as maybe a few struggles here and there, you have this ripple effect that ultimately has created a lot of change and changed a lot of lives for the better. But it was day in and day out sacrifice and leveraging those successes.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And it took Evan 32 years. He started working on gay marriage when he was in law school. He wrote his thesis in law school on the freedom to marry. So 32 years. And of course, many other movements have taken far longer than that. But you really, yes, if doing the work that we do, you really have to be able to celebrate the small wins, right, along the way, and prepare for the long haul.
So
I want to add too, though, that this is in context. 30 years is a long time, but it took 70 years for women to get the vote. So that's half the time.
Mm-hmm. Right.
Well, and perspective is always important. I mean, when you look at the timeline and perspective of human rights and ending slavery, all of these things, I think and we're in on our end here as a city, the MLK 50, the 50th year of the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr. and what that's meant for our city. But looking forward, how do we galvanize? How do we come together? How do we focus on diversity and inclusion? And I think these are all very real things that we need to focus on, but also to your point, perspective is important on those who have come before us, taking those lessons, but also to what they've sacrificed and all the time they put in to get us to this point today so that we can then carry forward and learn from it and come together. And I think this is all part of our human history, if you will, is being able to learn and share and collaborate. But ultimately, how do we find a way to move forward with love?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well said.
So
Yes.
Tell us, obviously, as we've painted the picture, we're kind of wrapping up on time, but who needs to read this book? Tell us the audiences, and I mean, obviously, those that are in the corporate sector of nonprofit work, who are in the corporate sector, but also serving on nonprofit boards, I should say. But those who are serving nonprofits who want to create change, who needs to read this book, though?
Working down from everyone, because we think it's a gift of good news. From across the country, leaders in the nonprofit sector, civic leaders, board members, philanthropists. We think that philanthropists reading this book may well decide to support some of the organizations, or support them even more by reading this book. All the practitioners in the nonprofit sector, and really in the public and private sector, who's interested in moving the world forward to improve the lives of everyone that lives on this planet.
Nice. Well, here's normally we do a little bit longer. We're just going to do a kind of a short version. It's kind of a lightning round. It's just fun, short answers, just general things about you personally. But the first one for both of you is, what do you like to do to relax?
I like to hike and entertain.
Nice.
With my husband.
And I swim, and I love to travel, and I read a lot. Or I listen to books now, which is great.
Nice. So what's a recent movie, or I'll say book, that you've read, so you can have a little bit of leeway since you enjoy reading, but give us a recent book or movie that you've read or seen.
I just read the 3 books written by Mary Renault on the life of Alexander the Great. And I found it fascinating. Yeah, I really found it fascinating. It's funny. It's about, there was Athens and then there was Macedon, where Alexander the Great came from, and a lot of his companions came from before they branched out and conquered, the rest of the known world at that time. And just in the New York Times the other day, they were talking about how the Greeks are protesting the use of the name Macedonia in a nearby country, calling it, I believe, the Republic of Macedonia. So there's still quite an interesting relevance after all these years.
Right. So I saw The Post recently with my 90-year-old parent. And it's almost a perfect movie, right? You've got Meryl Streep, you've got Tom Hanks, you have this great sort of detective story with all these twists and turns, and some of it you can't believe actually happened, but it did. So I would highly recommend it.
Well, the last question is, since both of you have the ties to Jersey and New York, I kind of get blessed to go up to New York quite a bit, but amazing city, amazing area. What's something that, for all of us who get a chance to go and travel there or do business there, what's something that we should definitely see? So what's a favorite either restaurant or a favorite spot? Give us something that we need to do. Here's your chance to promote New York City and promote the area. What should we do?
Sure. Okay. Well, I would say it's fine to go to the top of the Empire State Building, but you'll wait a long time. Instead, I would go to the top of the Rock, which is the top of 30 Rockefeller Center. It's tall, and the view is amazing, and it's beautiful. The building is beautiful as well.
I will say that.
So I would recommend that.
Nice. What's another one? Give me one more.
If it's warm weather, I always take people that come and visit us in New York City to the Green Market. It's in Union Square. It's an amazing experience of colors and tastes and smells, and it's set around a beautiful park, and it really shows off the richness of the outlying rural areas of New York. And, kind of gives you that connection a little more closely to, where your food comes from.
See, I'm building out my, what should we do next in New York City? So, well, I greatly appreciate it. Go ahead and tell listeners where they can learn more, not only about the book and obviously purchase the book, Big Impact, Insights and Stories from America's Nonprofit Leaders, but also where they can learn more about H2Growth Strategies.
Sure. So the best place is on our website, which is www.h2growth.com. So that's H2GROWTH.com.
And it's to the number. So H, the letter, to the number, and growth.com. Mm-hmm. Perfect.
Right. Thank you for that.
Well, Linda, Vivien, you two are changemakers. I greatly appreciate all you have done and being able to come here on the ChangeMakers podcast and share not only your stories and insight, but obviously all about the book and the fact that it is titled Big Impact, but I think it's going to have a big impact, and to be able to literally help others and achieve their success is going to be monumental. So for you sharing your time and efforts to do all those interviews and compile all that and the 7 principles and being able to share that. I greatly appreciate it. And you two, like I said, are definitely change makers. And we definitely encourage listeners to go online. Once again, the website, h2growth.com, learn more, get the book, Big Impact. And thank you two ladies for all you do and for coming on the show.
It was a pleasure.
Thank you for listening to the ChangeMakers podcast, produced by City Current and powered by Lipscomb & Pitts Insurance. To learn more about our guests and to share your stories of others leading by example, visit us online at citycurrent.com. Connect with us online using @citycurrent or follow the conversation using the hashtag ChangeMakers. Now, think big, start small, and act now. Be a change maker.